In July of 1961, something happened in Cameroon that would decide the fate of the country, and the consequences of that event is still destroying Cameroon till this day. A meeting that was meant for two entities to negotiate and unanimously agree became one of suppression, manipulation, and greed. On the surface, the event was about unity, about healing a country torn apart by colonial borders and foreign rule. It was presented as a reunion of brothers, separated by history, and finally coming back together as one people. But beneath the speeches, the smiles, and the carefully chosen words, something far more complex was taking shape. This was not just a conference. It was a battle of visions, a clash between two political cultures shaped by different colonial masters. One centralized and controlled, the other rooted in autonomy, negotiation, and the rule of law. And crucially, it was a meeting where power did not sit equally at the table. In this video, we shall be explaining the Foumban Conference like never before, telling you everything you need to know about this historic event. This is a conference that laid the foundation stone for Cameroon as we know today. This is an honest explanation of the Foumban Conference and the consequences that followed thereof. The name Cameroon itself originates from European contact. In 1472, Portuguese explorer Fernão Po sailed into the Wuri River near present-day Douala and encountered large quantities of shrimp. He named the river Rio dos Camarões, meaning River of Prawns. Over time, this name was adapted by other European languages, becoming Cameroun in French, Cameroon in German, and eventually Cameroon in English. What began as a simple geographic description would later become the name of a modern nation. For centuries, European presence along the Cameroonian coast was largely commercial. Portuguese, Dutch, British, and later German traders engaged in trade with coastal peoples, exchanging goods for palm oil, ivory, and enslaved Africans. Coastal groups such as the Douala acted as middlemen, controlling trade routes between Europeans and inland communities. During this period, European influence was limited to the coast, while indigenous political systems remained largely intact inland. This balance changed dramatically in the late 19th century during the scramble for Africa. In 1884, Germany formally established Cameroon as a colony after signing treaties with Douala chiefs, placing the territory under German protection. Thus began German Cameroon, one of Germany's most ambitious African colonies. The Germans pursued direct and authoritarian rule, using military expeditions to conquer resistance in the interior. Communities that opposed German control were violently suppressed, and large areas of fertile land were seized for plantations. German rule focused on economic exploitation. Vast plantations were created to grow cocoa, rubber, bananas, and palm oil, relying heavily on forced labor and harsh taxation. While the Germans built infrastructure such as railways, roads, ports, and administrative centers, these developments were designed to serve colonial extraction rather than African welfare. Education and political participation for Africans were minimal, and traditional authority was often undermined. Resistance was frequent and brutally crushed, leaving a legacy of trauma that shaped later nationalist movements. German control over Cameroon came to an abrupt end during World War I. Between 1914 and 1916, British and French forces launched a coordinated invasion of Cameroon. After fierce fighting, German forces were defeated and the colony collapsed. Following Germany's loss in the war, Cameroon was removed from German control and placed under League of Nations mandates, marking a turning point that would permanently alter the country's destiny. Under the mandate system, Cameroon was partitioned between France and Britain. France received the larger eastern portion, known as French Cameroon, while Britain was granted two narrow territories along the Nigerian border, Northern Cameroons and Southern Cameroons. This partition was not based on ethnic, cultural, or historical realities, but on colonial convenience. From that moment, Cameroon began developing along two separate political and cultural paths. In French Cameroon, France implemented a centralized system of administration rooted in French political culture. The French imposed their language, legal codes, and educational system, emphasizing assimilation and strong state authority. Political power was concentrated in colonial administrators, and African participation in governance was limited. Over time, nationalist movements emerged, most notably the Union des Populations du Cameroun, UPC, which demanded immediate independence and reunification of all Cameroonian territories. France responded harshly, banning the UPC and waging a violent counterinsurgency that lasted well into the late 1950s. British Cameroons followed a very different trajectory. Administered as part of British Nigeria, they were governed through indirect rule, which relied more heavily on local authorities and traditional institutions. English common law, parliamentary traditions, and local councils shaped political life. Education followed the British system, and political debate was more open. However, British Cameroons lacked full autonomy and were often treated as peripheral territories rather than a future nation in their own right. By the 1950s, the contrast between the two Cameroons was striking. French Cameroon moved rapidly toward independence, though under conditions of internal conflict and centralized authority. British Cameroons, meanwhile, faced political uncertainty. Many inhabitants resented governance from Nigeria, fearing marginalization within a much larger federation. At the same time, reunification with French Cameroon raised concerns about domination, cultural erosion, and loss of autonomy. Political leaders in southern Cameroons were divided between those favoring integration with Nigeria and those advocating reunification with French Cameroon as a way to restore Cameroon's historical unity. French Cameroon gained independence on January 1, 1960, becoming La République du Cameroun under President Amadou Ahidjo. Although independent, the new state inherited the centralized structures of French colonial rule and continued to face internal rebellion and security challenges. Reunification with British Cameroons was now presented as a national goal, but one shaped by the priorities of an already sovereign state. In February 1961, under United Nations supervision, a plebiscite was held in British Cameroons to determine their future. Crucially, voters were not given the option of full independence. They could only choose between joining Nigeria or joining the Republic of Cameroon. Northern Cameroons voted to join Nigeria, while Southern Cameroons voted to reunify with Cameroon. This vote set the stage for the Foumban Conference, which was supposed to determine how reunification between Southern Cameroons and French Cameroon would happen and what form the new state would take. The Foumban Conference was held from July 17th to July 21st, 1961, in the town of Foumban, the traditional seat of the Bamoun Kingdom. From the very first day, the atmosphere was carefully choreographed to project unity, dignity, and historical significance. Foumban itself was transformed into a political stage. Streets were cleaned and decorated, security was heightened, and traditional symbols were blended with modern state ceremony. The choice of venue was not accidental. Holding the conference in a royal town rather than a colonial capital was meant to signal national continuity, legitimacy, and African authority over the reunification process. Delegates arrived in Foumban over several days, with the most prominent figures receiving formal receptions. The French Cameroon delegation, led by President Amadou Ahidjo, arrived with the full dignity of a sovereign state. Ahidjo was welcomed with military honors, administrative officials, and traditional leaders. The Southern Cameroon's delegation, led by Prime Minister John Ngou arrived as representatives of a territory transitioning from UN trusteeship. Other Southern Cameroon's leaders included Augustine Ngom Jua, EML Endeli, and NN Mbili. They were greeted warmly but without the same institutional weight. From the outset, the difference in political status was visible, even in protocol. Traditional ceremonies played a central role in the opening moments of the conference. The Sultan, Fon, of Bamoun, as host, welcomed the delegations in line with Bamoun customs. Cultural performances, royal processions, and formal greetings were used to emphasize hospitality and unity. These rituals were meant to create an atmosphere of harmony and mutual respect, masking the intense political stakes beneath the surface. For the public and the press, Foumban appeared as a moment of national celebration rather than constitutional confrontation. The conference sessions themselves were held in a controlled and formal setting. Seating arrangements reflected hierarchy. The French Cameroon delegation sat as a unified bloc, while Southern Cameroon's delegates were fewer in number and more internally diverse. Proceedings were conducted largely in French, with translation provided, which subtly reinforced the dominance of French Cameroon's administrative culture. Timekeeping, agenda control, and documentation were managed by organizers aligned with the French Cameroon government, giving it significant procedural advantage. One of the most defining moments occurred at the very beginning of substantive discussions, when President Ahidjo's delegation presented a complete draft federal constitution. This document had been prepared in advance, largely by French-trained legal experts, and was introduced as the basis for discussion. Southern Cameroon's delegates were seeing the full text for the first time. There was no parallel draft from Southern Cameroons, nor had a joint drafting committee been established beforehand. This immediately framed the conference not as a co-creation process, but as a review of an already constructed constitutional vision. Discussions that followed were structured around this draft. Rather than negotiating fundamental principles, delegates were invited to comment, suggest amendments, or seek clarification from the already established constitution. Southern Cameroon's representatives raised concerns about the concentration of powers in the federal presidency, the protection of the English language, the survival of common law, and the degree of autonomy granted to the federated states. These interventions were noted, but the overall structure of the draft remained intact throughout the conference. The organization of the conference timetable further shaped outcomes. Sessions were tightly scheduled and lasted only a few days, leaving little room for prolonged debate or consultation. Informal discussions took place outside official meetings, but these were constrained by protocol and time pressure. Southern Cameroon's delegates had limited opportunity to caucus, seek expert legal advice, or consult their constituencies. By contrast, the French Cameroon delegation operated with a unified strategy and a clear mandate. Public messaging during the conference emphasized consensus and brotherhood. Statements released to the press highlighted cooperation, shared history, and the promise of reunification. Any signs of disagreement were downplayed. Official photographs showed smiling leaders, handshakes, and ceremonial unity. This external narrative was important for international audiences, particularly the United Nations, which was closely watching the reunification process. Social events were also part of the conference structure. Delegates attended shared meals, cultural evenings, and formal receptions hosted by traditional authorities and state officials. These events were designed to build rapport and soften tensions, but they also reinforced the symbolic power of the host state. Hospitality functioned as diplomacy, creating an environment where outright confrontation felt socially and politically difficult. The delegation from Southern Cameroon had a great time, which might have affected their firmness to the decisions that were taken. As the conference progressed, it became increasingly clear that there would be no fundamental renegotiation of the constitutional framework. Amendments suggested by Southern Cameroon's delegates focused on wording and assurances rather than structural change. The strong federal presidency, centralized control over key sectors, and limited state autonomy remained core features. The momentum of the conference pushed toward endorsement rather than redesign. The closing phase of the Foumban Conference was swift. Final revisions were made, largely technical in nature, and the constitution was presented as an agreed document. There was no formal vote recorded in the manner of a constitutional convention, nor was the text subjected to a popular referendum in southern Cameroons. Instead, acceptance was expressed through political assent by delegation leaders. Ceremonial language emphasized unity, historic achievement, and the dawn of a new Cameroon. The conference concluded with closing ceremonies that mirrored the opening, traditional displays, formal speeches, and symbolic gestures of unity. Foumban returned to quiet soon after, but the document produced there would shape Cameroon's political life for decades. In practical terms, the Foumban Conference functioned less as a negotiation between equals and more as a carefully managed constitutional presentation, wrapped in tradition, diplomacy, and urgency. What happened in those few days was decisive, not because of loud conflict or dramatic confrontation, but because of how quietly and efficiently the future of a reunified Cameroon was settled. The Foumban Conference did not produce a signed treaty in the classic sense. Instead, its outcome was the Federal Constitution of Cameroon, which became effective on October 1, 1961. The clauses and agreements of Foumban are therefore best understood as the key constitutional provisions that were presented, discussed, and ultimately adopted. Below is a clear, detailed breakdown of those core clauses and agreements, explained in substance rather than legal jargon. 1. Creation of a federal state. The most fundamental agreement at Foumban was the establishment of the Federal Republic of Cameroon. The new state was to consist of two federated states: East Cameroon, former French Cameroon; West Cameroon, former British Southern Cameroons. This clause formally ended the separation created by colonial rule and recognized reunification as a constitutional fact. However, it was a two-state federation, not a loose confederation, meaning sovereignty rested primarily with the federal government. 2. Single federal sovereignty. The constitution declared that sovereignty belonged to the Federal Republic, not to the individual states. West Cameroon did not enter the Union as an independent state surrendering powers by treaty. Instead, it became a federated unit within an already sovereign republic. This clause was crucial because it legally positioned reunification as integration, not a merger of equals. 3. Strong federal presidency. One of the most significant and controversial clauses was the creation of a powerful federal executive president. The president was both head of state and head of government, controlled defense, foreign affairs, currency, national security, and major economic policy, had authority to appoint and dismiss key officials, including state-level leaders in practice. Could rule by decree under certain conditions. This clause concentrated power at the center and limited the practical autonomy of the federated states. 4. Federal legislature structure. The Constitution established a federal National Assembly, elected at the national level. Although the federation had two states, legislative power was not equally divided between them. Representation was largely population-based, which gave East Cameroon a numerical advantage due to its larger population. There was no equal state upper chamber like a Senate to protect minority state interests. 5. Limited state autonomy. West and East Cameroon were granted state governments, each with a prime minister, a House of Assembly, authority over certain local matters such as primary education, local administration, and cultural affairs. However, these powers were subordinate to federal authority. Federal law took precedence over state law in cases of conflict, significantly weakening the federal balance. 6. Language provisions. The Constitution declared English and French as official languages of the Federal Republic. This clause was presented as a safeguard for Anglophone identity. In theory, both languages were to be used in administration, legislation, and courts. In practice, no strong enforcement mechanisms were included, leaving implementation dependent on federal goodwill. 7. Legal system recognition. The Constitution acknowledged the existence of two legal traditions: common law in West Cameroon, civil law in East Cameroon. West Cameroon was allowed to retain common law courts. However, the federal judicial system was centralized, and ultimate judicial authority rested with federal institutions, not state courts. 8. Education system autonomy, limited. West Cameroon retained its British-style education system, including examinations and curricula, at least initially. However, education policy was not fully protected by entrenched constitutional clauses, allowing future harmonization under federal control. 9. Absence of secession rights. There was no clause granting a right to secession or withdrawal from the federation. Once reunification occurred, it was constitutionally irreversible. This omission later became central to Anglophone grievances. 10. Transitional arrangements. The Constitution included transitional provisions. Amadou Ahidjo remained federal president. John Foncha became vice president. Existing administrations were to be gradually integrated. These arrangements ensured continuity of power and stability, but also preserved existing. 11. Constitutional amendment procedure. Amending the Constitution required approval through federal institutions, where East Cameroon held numerical and political advantage. No special protection was provided for West Cameroon to veto changes affecting its autonomy. This made future centralization legally easy. 12. National Unity Clause. The Constitution emphasized indivisibility and unity of the state. Any political movement seen as threatening national unity could be restricted or banned, giving the federal government wide discretion to suppress. In essence, the Foumban Conference produced a federal state in name, a unitary logic in practice, reunification without parity, autonomy without strong guarantees. The clauses favored central authority over negotiated federalism, making later abolition of the federation legally and politically possible, something that happened in 1972. The consequences of the Foumban Conference are deep, long-lasting, and central to Cameroon's modern crisis. They are not limited to constitutional changes alone. They reshaped power, identity, governance, and political trust in ways that still define the country today. These are some of the consequences of the conference. 1. Centralization of power in Yaoundé. One of the most immediate consequences of the Foumban Conference was the institutionalization of a strong central state. Although the Constitution created a federation on paper, it concentrated real authority in the federal presidency. Key areas such as defense, foreign policy, finance, currency, and national security were placed firmly under federal control. This meant that West Cameroon entered reunification with limited practical autonomy, while East Cameroon retained dominance through population size and control of federal institutions. Over time, decision-making increasingly shifted to Yaoundé, weakening regional self-government. 2. Weak and fragile federalism. The federal structure created at Foumban lacked strong safeguards to protect the autonomy of West Cameroon. There was no equal state chamber, no entrenched veto power, and no requirement for mutual consent on constitutional changes affecting state powers. As a result, federalism existed more as a political promise than a protected system. This structural weakness made it legally and politically easy to dismantle the federation later. 3. Abolition of the federation in 1972. Perhaps the most direct long-term consequence of Foumban was the abolition of the federal system itself. In 1972, President Amadou Ahidjo organized a national referendum that replaced the Federal Republic with a unitary state. Because Foumban did not include strong constitutional protections for federalism, West Cameroon had no legal mechanism to block this change. This marked the formal end of the political autonomy promised in 1961 and transformed Cameroon into a highly centralized republic. 4. Erosion of Anglophone political autonomy. Following Foumban, and especially after 1972, Anglophone institutions were progressively weakened or absorbed. The office of Prime Minister of West Cameroon was abolished, the House of Assembly dissolved, and regional authority transferred to centrally appointed officials. Over time, Anglophones lost control over their own administration, education policy, and local governance. This erosion fostered a growing sense of political marginalization. 5. Marginalization of the English language and common law. Although the Foumban Constitution recognized English and French as official languages, it provided no enforcement mechanisms. In practice, French became dominant in administration, courts, and public life. Similarly, the common law system of West Cameroon was gradually undermined by civil law practices, particularly in national courts and legal administration. These changes contributed to Anglophone protests decades later, especially among law teachers. 6. Birth of the Anglophone problem. The Foumban Conference is widely regarded as the origin point of the Anglophone problem. Because reunification occurred without full negotiation or popular ratification in southern Cameroons, many Anglophones later viewed the process as imposed rather than agreed upon. Grievances related to underrepresentation, cultural assimilation, and constitutional betrayal trace their roots directly to Foumban. 7. Symbolic loss of equal partnership. Foumban shaped reunification as an absorption into an existing state, not a merger of equals. Over time, symbolic actions reinforced this perception, most notably the 1984 renaming of the country to La République du Cameroun, the same name held by French Cameroon before reunification. Many Anglophones interpreted this as symbolic erasure of the Reunification Act. 8. Growth of federalist and separatist movements. As frustrations accumulated, political movements advocating federalism, decentralization, or outright separation emerged in Anglophone regions. These movements often cite Foumban as the foundational injustice. What began as demands for constitutional reform gradually escalated into more radical positions, especially as peaceful advocacy produced limited results. 9. Crisis of political trust. A lasting consequence of Foumban is a deep trust deficit between Anglophone communities and the central state. The perception that promises made in 1961 were later abandoned created skepticism toward national dialogue, reforms, and decentralization efforts. Many Anglophones view state initiatives through the lens of betrayal. 10. Long-term national instability. Ultimately, the Foumban Conference contributed to structural instability within Cameroon. By prioritizing unity over equality and control over consent, it created unresolved contradictions at the heart of the state. These tensions erupted dramatically in the Anglophone crisis from 2016 onward, but their roots stretch back to the constitutional choices made at Foumban. The Foumban Conference achieved reunification, but at a cost. Its consequences include centralized power, weakened federalism, Anglophone marginalization, and enduring political conflict. What was presented as a moment of national unity became, over time, one of the most contested events